everybody. So I am not the usual host of Explore Arkansas, but I like to pop in every now and then just to make sure everything's going well. Not really, it's going great, but they invite me to come and lecture sometimes, particularly when we study historical artists. So you may remember me from the first time we did these lectures. I kind of introduced what Explore Arkansas art was, that we were going to be studying not only contemporary and contemporary artists, but we were also going to be studying some historical artists that were pretty popular in their day to the either Fort Smith area or regionally around Arkansas. And so one of those artists, and what a lot of historians dub as kind of a feminist Arkansas icon of sorts, is Caroline Shawk Brooks. And she was fondly known as the Butter Woman, which makes her even more intriguing to me, if you like butter, if you like that thing. So one of my favorite quotes from her is this: "There's an idea, a conception of the face which the artist gets and can never give it to any other one." And this was done during an interview when she was exhibiting one of her butter sculptures. The interviewer was asking her, you know, how do you come up with these such detailed faces that just embody the character of the person so well, that is such of their likeness in the medium of butter in particular? But she kind of spun it around and said it's really not about the butter, even though that is her favorite medium to use, but it was more about really trying to get to know the figure. Or she also worked in like mythological figures. She did a Christopher Columbus bust in butter as well. And she said that every face is individual to their own person. And so I like to really try to dig in and get to know that person, is essentially what she's saying. And it did help if she could meet them. There were some busts that she did where she got to meet certain people, and others where she just kind of read about them because they were historical figures. She did busts of royalty, various royalty in Europe as well, just because that was very popular at the time. You can imagine that the idea of colonial style portraits were very big still. This classical style that we kind of look at, where it's very realistic busts or portraits of people, were still very, very popular. So, but I like this quote because it also puts her in this stage of fine artist. And we don't necessarily think that when we consider a woman who is a sculptor in butter, right? So we'll kind of dig into it. Now, this is actually a picture of her exhibiting her Columbus sculpture, which is actually very good if you look at portraits of Christopher Columbus. So she definitely studied to see what those portraits were. But the interesting thing about Caroline is she did start out in more, I guess, traditional materials. So she was very artistic as a child. She actually grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and eventually settled in Helena, Arkansas. I'm actually not sure how you pronounce that. I've always said it Helena, but you know, whatever. I could be wrong. But she eventually settled there with her husband, Samuel H. Brooks, who came on to become kind of a local political figure. But she started out in the more traditional forms of clay and marble, and eventually started moving on to butter. Now, where did this idea of butter come along? Women actually used butter molds at the time, and it was kind of like this idea of these domestic arts that we kind of always hear of throughout history. It was just a trend that when they were setting the table, or they were hosting these, you know, kind of elaborate gatherings, or just had people over for dinner, afternoon tea, whatever, they would use these butter molds to mold that particular butter that you would use for your meal into kind of these elaborate sculpture-like things. But like I said, they used molds. Now, Caroline Shawk Brooks, who was very artistic at a young age and already kind of knew her way around clay, particularly at the time, moved on to butter. And as we can see, she was very talented. One of her favorite things, and where she started out, were these busts. But she does go on to make life-size sculptures of butter later on in her career, much like the Elon, or however you want to pronounce it. This was actually based off of folklore. This is a figure that she liked. So she liked various mythologies. She was an avid reader. She was very, very bright. She was pretty well educated. But one of her favorite things to do was to read folklore herself and read it to her and Samuel's daughter as well. And she was very inspired by this particular figure, Elon, who I want to say was from a German folklore or German myth. But what happened is that she was raised by her parents, but she was born blind. But her parents never told her she was blind or anything was wrong with her until right around her 16th or 17th birthday, when she finally learned the truth. And so to Caroline, Elon kind of represented this idea of innocence, and she liked to portray her sleeping, because that was another innocent way of portraying this particular figure. But she was really inspired by kind of these mythological folklore type stories. And Elon was actually one of her most famous, if not her most famous sculpture. We don't have a lot of pictures of Caroline's work, but Elon they did do a very good job documenting this particular figure. But you should know that Caroline Shawk Brooks did not just work in butter, although we're going to go back to her butter sculptures. She also worked in marble and more traditional materials as well. She exhibited her butter sculptures and a lot of her other works at various exhibitions kind of all around the country, and centennials in particular. And that's where she actually became fondly known as the Butter Woman. She exhibited at a location where they did an Arkansas centennial. And locals around, she kind of made a name for herself and would sculpt various things for her friends. So much, and she was so good that a lot of men in particular at the time, a lot of these kind of journalists that were writing for papers and would record local history, kind of these wannabe historians would say that, oh, she just uses molds like every other person. But I show you these marble sculptures because you need to know that she's not lying. She was very talented. She knew how to sculpt the human face in particular, was very well trained in a sense. And she actually challenged the guy that said, oh, you must be using molds, when she was at a centennial, or I think at some form of exhibition. And she said, well, how about I just sculpt you something in butter right now? And she did. And she had a full bust of, I want to say, this guy's portrait or another portrait, maybe a royal figure of some sort, in about an hour and a half. And she was like, well, I proved my point, didn't I? Was pretty much her response, which I think is iconic. So, but like I said, she did dive into these marble reliefs, and all of these are actually sold to private patrons. So unfortunately, I don't know that we're ever going to get to see one of her works. And since most of her work was in butter, we definitely don't get to see it, because like you can't just preserve butter like you can preserve marble or clay sculptures. But she definitely had a talent for portraying certain characteristic and realistic characteristics, as you can see. And one of her favorite things to do was perform these kind of relief busts right here. So this is her Marble of Music, which is made in around 1880. And this is titled Saint with Cherub. Like I said, she was very inspired by other stories. Obviously, she was raised in the Bible Belt South. She grew up in Ohio, moved from Cincinnati, came to Arkansas. And so she was obviously inspired by various stories in the Christian faith as well. And even probably stories kind of like that circled around, I know that she knew quite a bit about George and the Dragon, and other various stories that circled around Christianity that were more folklore and myth. But she's very inspired by these other stories as well, and very talented in traditional materials. So when we fondly think of her as the Butter Woman, it wasn't as if she couldn't or didn't have enough talent to use marble or clay. She actually is recorded saying, I just prefer butter because you can almost make it do anything you want and it responds better. The only challenge with butter is trying to move it around to go to various destinations and various exhibitions. She even actually shipped one of her life-size Elon sculptures to Paris. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get back to her butter sculptures. But I wanted to show you just a quick detail of her signing her name. We don't have, like I said, we don't have a lot of her works anymore, and a lot of them have been sold to private collectors, even private institutions. So unfortunately, we cannot just go and see them, and this means that they're not photographs very well as either. But she was a very prolific artist. She pretty much traveled the whole country and was very fondly known by her title, the Butter Woman. And she did not actually like that title at first. At first, she was like, no, I want to be taken seriously. But because so many people called her that, it kind of became like this very charming name that the locals in Arkansas would call her and what she was known for. And so she just kind of embraced that idea as well. She did own a studio in New York, and I'm not sure how long she actually stayed in New York, but she definitely practiced and made artworks for about 3 to 4 years while she was there. She was known to be very dedicated to her work as well, because she wanted to be considered a very serious artist. And this is a portrait of her with one of her butter sculptures at Armory Hall in 1877. And it's very interesting because she's recorded in history not as being this this family woman and really involved with her husband's life and politics, but she kind of had this idea of family, but then it was almost eclipsed by the idea of her art because she was so popular. And that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of photographs, particularly of her work, because when she would go to shows, she would take these works either in marble, most of them in butter, and they would sell so quickly that we couldn't or that the photographers or journalists at the time couldn't actually record many of her works before they were kind of swiped up because she was so popular. And she was a bit, as you can imagine, she was a bit unique. You didn't have a lot of female sculptors at the time. You had some that were going to school and being trained in Paris and Rome. But for the most part, you didn't have a lot of American sculptors in particularly. And so she was almost like America's sweetheart, right? And she kind of embodied this idea simultaneously a fine artist and this kind of probably more controversial today, but wasn't as controversial then, this idea of domesticity. And so people were very charmed by her, right? They were interested in her life. And this idea of working in butter in particular was like, this idea was that she was relatable to people and relatable to all people. So even women that weren't fine artists, but that were concerned more about their domestic role as well. She was kind of an inspiration to everyone everywhere, and was had a very good sense of humor. So this is her Elon sculpture, which and this is the one I think she did end up shipping to Paris. I could be wrong there because she did make quite a few, but it is one of the only recorded pictures we have. And her only challenge, she said, about working in butter, because a lot of people found it very tedious, they found it difficult, too much pressure here, too much pressure here, and the sculpture would be somewhat ruined, right? But she said that it was a lot like what we would maybe call acrylic painting. You can go over, or oil painting, I mean, you can go over and you can cover what you've mistaken. With marble, once you make a move, you make a move. With watercolor, once you make a move, you make a move. It's hard to reverse and go back. She said butter was very easy to sculpt with, and if there were any mistakes that she could easily fix what she had done. But I mean, it's very hard to imagine that this Elon full-size sculpture is actually in butter and not marble, because it looks so much like Renaissance masters, honestly. She pays careful attention to the body, and obviously it is very modest because at the time female bodies were very modest. But she pays particular attention to her hair, even her profile, and she even puts all of these floral elements and embellishments all over. As you can see, she is very careful with the details of making it very realistic and as if you're actually coming upon a sleeping figure, right? And so she's definitely learning from classical and historical artists in the past, and incorporating that in her own unique way. But she kind of solved the problem, although shipping it anywhere was a little bit of a risk. She thought it was funny because one time they didn't even record it as a butter sculpture. They just said, this thing is like 100 pounds of butter in a box, because they didn't know what it was. And she thought it was very funny. She thought it was very entertaining. She says, yes, I'm going to get my 100-pound box of butter and go to Paris. So don't mind me. But she had a very good sense of humor about it. And I mean, I think you would probably have to, because butter has never really made it onto the fine art scene, even though, as you can see, and you will see at the end of this lecture, people still sculpt it with it, actually, in certain pockets in the US and worldwide. So she actually figured out this whole thing that you can preserve the sculpture very well if you ship it on ice. That way, the fluctuating temperature, whether you're at sea or whether it's hot summer in Paris or Rome or wherever she was actually shipping her stuff, that with ice, you could actually control that small environment and keep that butter sculpture relatively cool. That way it wasn't prone. So when you hit rough waters, even when you're unloading it, somebody may have slipped or anything like that, that the sculpture could actually be pretty well preserved on ice. And so that's kind of how she figured out how to ship her work. So not only was she a good artist, she was very smart too. Now this is one of my favorite portraits of her. I'm pretty partial to portrait busts as well, so I could be biased. But this is Dreaming Elon. This was one of her first renditions of the Elon figure that we see. And she exhibited this as the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Ohio. And she became, this is really kind of what put her on the map as well. She exhibited this same work in Arkansas, which is how she finally became known as the Butter Woman. But this was one of her first figures that she worked on. And as you can see, if you told me that this was in marble or clay, I would believe you. I would not ever think it was a work in butter, but it is. And this is kind of what put her on the map. And she's a very interesting figure to study. Unfortunately, there's not just a ton recorded about her, but I think it's very neat that she resided in Arkansas and made such a name for herself. It's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of her work recorded that we can go and study further and have more, modern historians go and study her. But that is kind of the beast of studying women in art. During our series of Women in Art, we kind of know that female artists weren't necessarily taken as seriously as men. And so unfortunately, it's not that they weren't prolific at the time. It's just that us looking at history don't have a lot that we can go on, which is kind of the beast of history itself. But just know that she was very popular in Arkansas, and really she was very nationally recognized. All of her work sold very quickly. I know that some of her work resides in DC. There were documents that saw her work actually travel back and forth from Paris to Rome and would eventually reside somewhere in Europe, as long as the butter would hold, pretty much. And like I said, most of her marble and clay pieces are in private collections. And so she was a very well-known artist at the time. And I thought this was a very interesting article that I wanted to kind of talk about. She was really known to be wedded to her art, as the title says. And this was an interview at the World's Fair. And this goes on to kind of ask her, what inspires you? This is where the same article that I got that quote from. But what I wanted to focus on was this idea of being wedded to her art. It was very unique at the time, especially considering kind of women's roles that were expected, from, 1850s to about 1950s. So that span of 100 years. Well, and even before then, there was this expectation of what women should do, and they should be there for their families. They should be in their domestic roles. And so it's interesting that Caroline was so invested in her work, even so much that her husband and her eventually were separated at one point when she went off to New York to found and build her studio. Now, her husband died, I believe, shortly after that time period in New York, but it really is interesting because you don't hear a lot about her family. You hear more about her art as history records her. So that is a very interesting thing, and a lot of historians, especially kind of local regional historians in Arkansas, consider her as this pioneer feminist figure in the fine arts, which goes very well into kind of how we introduced and explore Arkansas arts, especially how we wrapped it up with this idea of the Penn women and who they are and how important they were to future female artists in Arkansas. And so we're happy to add Caroline Shawk Brooks to that list as kind of this very pioneering figure of kind of chasing this idea of becoming a professional and world-renowned artist. Now, what came later for butter sculpture? Well, let me show you. Although you don't see butter sculptures in museums, or very rarely, people still do it. And so certain pockets, mostly around the Midwest, you can see some, like in the Northeast, you'll have butter sculpting competitions. And I like to think that Caroline Shawk Brooks was probably the founding mother of such a thing, because no one was really working in butter sculptures at the time. Like I said, most of the people that were working in butter were women, and they were using molds. They weren't necessarily putting their work up for exhibition. You know, maybe at the local grocery store, maybe at a local department store, they would show their work in molds. But Caroline was an actual sculptor. And so she was, I think she just definitely paved the way for future butter sculptures. And as you can see, these are very good. I included one of Harry Potter because how could you not? But as you can also see, Caroline's work is very realistic. She was working in a very classical tradition. As good as this is and as impressive this is as being butter, I think you can definitely see in terms of quality the difference in what Caroline was doing versus what contemporary artists do today. Not taking anything away. I could not sculpt in butter to save my life. But you can see the talent that Caroline Brooks had, not only as the butter woman, but as a fine artist. And she had excellent training. Now, this was my favorite of the contemporary works. This is Grant's American Gothic, or inspired by American Gothic, the painting, which I think we probably all know and are very fond of. But as you can see, this idea of butter sculpture remains not necessarily popular, but is popular in some niches of fine and contemporary art. And we have Caroline Brooks to thank for that, because if she had not gone on exhibiting her work throughout history and kind of through the late, from 1860 to about the mid 1880s, we probably wouldn't, I doubt that we would be having all of these butter sculptures around, because she kind of reinforced this idea that you don't have to use mold, but butter could actually be an actual material in order to creatively express and artistically express an idea or a concept, or even figures that you're wanting to use. And so she's definitely unique. Not only was she a woman kind of going outside of her expected societal role, she's remembered more as a fine artist, more than a family woman. And she was working as a fine artist in a very unexpected and unique medium that was well respected by peers and critics alike. And so she was a very, I think, influential and pioneering figure. And I think we should be very proud that she was from Arkansas and had a lot to say. She was kind of, I think pioneer is probably the best word to say. Like I said, she was very open. She had a good sense of humor. She loved speaking in interviews. And so she's definitely an interesting figure if you ever have time just to go and research her and kind of what her life was like. And definitely I like to fold her in kind of with the Arkansas Pen Women, that she definitely made an impact in terms of what contemporary artists are building on now in the Arkansas area. So that's the unique and fascinating history of butter sculpture. And it's all thanks to Arkansas's own Caroline Shawk Brooks. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm by no means an expert on her life, but I definitely wanted to highlight this unique artist to Arkansas.
All right, looks like Al might have a question. Let's see. Hold on. We gotta unmute you, Al. You'll have to push the button. There you go.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. I got in a little late to the meeting, and I wanted to ask, what did she make her molds out of? And how did she make them? I mean, that's where the art is, isn't it?
She did not use molds. So what I found is that she did like her full-size Elon figure so well that she did make a type of, what she called it, like a wet cast. She figured out how to make plaster and kind of oil it up, and naturally butter is very oily. So she did make a plaster cast from her butter sculpture. I'm assuming that was frozen. From what I read, I'm sure maybe I'm misunderstanding, but from what I read, you know, she wanted to save this particular one, but that was the only recorded mold that she actually used, was this Elon figure, and she sculpted each figure for each exhibition. So say for Paris, she would sculpt a whole new Elon figure or sleeping figure or bust. She didn't use that particular mold repeatedly, but she did want to keep it if she ever wanted to use it again.
Also, what were her dates?
Her dates, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was born in 1840, and she began to exhibit her work about the mid 1860s. I want to say that her first work was recognized in 1867.
So which World's Fair were you talking about in New York?
I think that one was in New York. The World Fair was. She did exhibit at a centennial in Ohio, and she did exhibit at a centennial exhibition in Arkansas. And her work was found at another fair in Paris. This particular, from the article, I believe that one was in New York.
I think the earliest World's Fair in New York was 1937 or something like 1939.
Really?
That would have been.
Yeah, September, it looks like it says September 11th, right? But it doesn't have the year.
World's Fair, September 11th. Yeah, I should have. It could have been in Italy. I always assumed that it was in New York simply because of the man interviewing her. And we have so many articles of interviews in English. But that would be an interesting question.
Right.
I bet I could find it for you real quick. Let's see.
By the way, the link to get on the this video, the Zoom, was wrong. I was late. I was late because I had to go to Zoom itself and get on with the meeting ID.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I'm very sorry about that.
Oh, you're to blame, huh?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm to blame, but I'll take responsibility for it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Switching over to virtual sometimes has those kinks, but you know, we're working to fix it, and next one will be a lot easier.
Yeah,
What's the next one about?
Oh, so our next one is actually lecture live. That's next week. But of course, we also have another Explore Arkansas art after that, and that'll be with artist Lisa Krenitchfeld. And once we kind of end up the questions, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Did we find the answer to our question, Samantha?
We did not. Unfortunately, it's not credited to where the actual location is. I would assume if the World's Fair, if it's not in New York, I would assume that it would be somewhere in Rome or Paris, possibly.
It does say Italy on there, but that might not be.
Yeah, I'm trying to. From what I thought that was her shipping to Italy at some point. but this wasn't where the interview is. So I think that's probably why I assumed it was in New York. But I could always do some deep diving, see if I can find it.
Well, I was interested because, you know, I knew about the 1939. Well, in fact, I attended the 1939 World's Fair as a child.
Wow.
So,
That's cool.
I bet that was something.
Do you even remember it? Were you like,
yeah.
Yeah. From what I understand from just the research that I did on her, she was a very prolific and internationally known artist during her time. So it is unfortunate that we don't have more, or at least better photographs of her work. But butter is tough to photograph, and it's even tougher to preserve. So I think the only reason we have her Elon sculptures are probably because we did have the mold that she used, and that was the one she was really concerned about preserving on ice during its shipping. So yeah, she was a very interesting figure to study, and definitely she was in Paris for a little while, but primarily her studio was found in New York when she was very active during those 3 years, and the rest of the time she was usually in Arkansas.
Okay. So I think it's about ending up the lecture, unless you have another question. Al?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that?
All right. Yeah. Do you have another question? Or maybe Hannah?
No, I'm fine.
All right. So I guess this is my turn to talk a little bit about our programs coming up with the education department, and also with some of our things happening around the museum. So if you haven't already seen or heard about it, we recently got a new mural at the Regional Art Museum. Our muralist, Caitlin Noel-Nick, came the preceding weekend. She painted a really nice, swooping, colorful mural in front of the Regional Art Museum. And we have a time lapse that's gone out on our YouTube channel and of course in our mailers. So if you haven't already, be sure to check that out and see what we got in store. In addition, as you probably have maybe attended before, we also have our RAM sketch class that happens every Tuesday night. This upcoming class is actually going to be over atmospheric perspective. So a technique kind of used by David Hockney and a lot of other contemporary artists, as well as the masters. So atmospheric perspective is what we got up next. And I think one after that is actually a study of Wassily Kandinsky landscape with village. And so we're gonna, we're kind of getting a couple classes on landscape, and then we're gonna transfer to figures after those couple of sessions. But this upcoming session is actually going to be landscape and atmospheric perspective. And then of course, next week, around the same time, 7 p.m. Yes? Did I hear a question? Sorry about that. Must be something off in the distance. So next week we have Lecture Live, Renaissance, or Byzantine versus Renaissance, where modernism began. Really looking forward to that one. I love the Byzantine era, and kind of like almost medieval, but not quite. And kind of transitioning into the more Renaissance era. And so look forward to that. And that's the subject of our Lecture Live. And of course, the next Explore Arkansas art series, which is not next week, but next week on the 15th, we actually have artist Lisa Krenitschfeld coming in, and she's going to do a lecture and kind of a live artist Q&A. And she works with female figures, and mixed media. And she actually won the Delta exhibition a couple years back. I believe it was in 2018. So that's something to look forward to. And I believe that may wrap up some of the things. Lena, did I miss anything?
I think you covered everything. So we have one more lecture live, which she covered, but then after that, we're going to start a whole new series. It's just sexuality and art, so that should be interesting. And that'll probably start the first part of May, and then we'll do it every other week. So that'll be part of our lecture live series, and it'll last through the summer. So tune in.
All right.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you. Yes, I loved learning about the butter woman.
I feel like be in the kitchen and like just
butter's so hard, I bet. Yeah, to work with.
Like the possibilities are endless. You just need a 1 pound tub of butter and just go to town.
Oh yeah, I think you need 100 pounds.
Maybe a 5 pound tub of butter to do a bust. Yeah.
Gotta let it soften though, guys.
That's true. That's true.
Just a little bit, otherwise.
And put it on ice to show all of your family for the next year.
Absolutely.
Mm.
All right. Thank you guys so much.